Good morning. We are going to take a slight departure today after opening prayer. We're going to go down some rabbit holes. In fact, I brought a backhoe because when we get into the weeds, we're going to need it. So, who do we have to add onto our prayer list this morning? Yes, ma'am. Oh. Okay. Did you get that, Wade? Martha Rose. Okay. Anyone else? All right. Thank you. Okay, now that you've had a chance to look at the maps, and okay, we're going to get to them in a few minutes. You may remember seeing this one before, but just we're going to look at it in a different light. So, I wanted to take a side note for today before we got too much further into Isaiah. One of the things that Isaiah deals a lot with, and we've talked about over the last few weeks, is Samaria and the fall of the northern 10 tribes and then being carried off into captivity, which is what results in the formation of Samaria. And that's what I want you to take a look at these maps. If you'll notice on the big one, this is the promised land after Joshua got done dividing it up. Okay. This one is that same region during the time of Christ. So I've thought about having overlays up there, but I don't have that much energy. But if you look at them on top of each other, you can see where Samaria falls right on top of the original land. And it's important because if you remember last week in chapter 28, when Isaiah talks about the drunkards of Ephraim, you can see that Samaria falls over the area of Ephraim and part of Manasseh. And it was referred to as a half-tribe because Manasseh was split on both sides of the Jordan. So from a geographical standpoint, I wanted you to see this, to be able to actually see it and not just hear about it as we go through this, because I think it helps make a lot of sense. So, what was the primary issue from 50,000 feet between the Jews and the Samaritans? Let me rephrase the question. How did Samaria start? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the very beginnings of it, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's how the rifts begin. Mm-hmm. It is, because again, look at the geography. Samaria is right there on Ephraim and part of Manasseh. Okay, now, where Samaria actually comes from is after the Assyrians take over the 10 tribes, the area of the 10 tribes, and send them into captivity and bring in foreigners. And so then what happens with these Ephraimites and these Manassites with the foreigners? They intermarry. Okay, and that's how Samaria develops. Now, not all of them did, obviously, but that's how this whole snowball gets going, following Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the split. Okay. So, the first question that came to me is, why wouldn't they have paid attention to that? So, we're going to start this morning in Leviticus. Okay. Leviticus, according to the dates that I found, was written approximately 40 years before Joshua took over and went into the Promised Land. Other dates say that Joshua was about 70 years old when he entered the Promised Land. So that means that it's safe to say that Joshua was more than aware of Moses' teachings that are recorded in Leviticus and in Numbers and Deuteronomy, because they're all in that same time frame. In fact, Joshua would have been what would be considered a full adult under Jewish law, because he would have been right around 30 years old. So you see this working along as well in this whole beginning time frame. It's not unreasonable to assume or conclude that Joshua sat at the feet of Moses when Moses was penning these things, much the way Barnabas and Paul were along with each other. In fact, if you go to Deuteronomy 3:21, Moses essentially says that very thing. And it was written about 1450, shortly before Joshua assumes the leadership. I'll give you a second to get to Deuteronomy 3. (3:21). At that time I commanded Joshua, you have seen with your own eyes all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings. The Lord will do the same to all the kingdoms over there where you're going. So no, he doesn't say you were sitting here, but it's not hard to extract from this language, especially the beginning, at that time I commanded Joshua, that this wouldn't have been the only command that he gave to Joshua. So maybe I'm stretching a little bit, but I don't think so. I think when we read all of it that ties Joshua and Moses together, I think it's very reasonable to assume that Joshua was more than intimately aware of everything that was being written and everything that was being instructed. And I think that's, if you remember back last year when we dealt with Joshua, Joshua was very hard line about following God. And I think this is where it originates. Now, if we go back through and we just kind of scan Leviticus, because we're not here to do an in-depth study of Leviticus, you find the first chapters deal with purity of sacrifice and how they're performed, dietary restrictions, and similar things to that. Basically laying out what the Jews were supposed to do to be obedient. And that's just kind of a quick summary. But what I want to take one side path on is in chapter 17. So if you all will turn to Leviticus 17. And we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. And any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement. What does that immediately bring to mind? Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you look for patterns, the pattern for Christ's sacrifice is found in the law that was given to the Jews in Leviticus. Because it's incredibly clear. I went to Bible Hub, and I've talked about this before with the 31 translations. All but 4 of the translations use atonement, which I thought was unique. The New Jerusalem Bible uses an interesting term, expiate, which the direct translation means to atone for. So you see the same pattern. You don't see any movement. The 4 expounded versions, as I like to call them because I'm trying to be nice, the ones that aren't really translations, they take translations and they rewrite them to contemporary language. The New Living uses an interesting phrase, purifying you, making you right with God. The contemporary English, life is in the blood, and I have given you the blood of animals to sacrifice in place of your own. God's Word translation, I have given this blood to you to make peace with me on the altar. Blood is needed to make peace with me. And the Good News translation, the life of every living thing is in the blood, and that is why the Lord has commanded that all blood be poured out on the altar to take away people's sins. Blood, which is life, takes away sins. I don't want to spend a lot of time on there, but as I went through this in developing this for Samaria, I came across this, and I thought it was beautiful. And I think that's something that we want to, it's another arrow to put in our quiver when we talk with other people about why Christ had to die on the cross. Okay. All right. One more note on that. Where is our New Testament reference that backs this up? Hebrews, thank you. Hebrews 9, if you all turn there. Beginning in verse 15. Therefore, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died to redeem them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to establish the death of the one who made it. Because a will does not take effect until the one who made it has died, it cannot be executed while he is still alive. So this all ties back to Leviticus. I've said it before. We wonder why the Jews were so antagonistic to Christ. They knew these things. They knew exactly what these things meant. And when the writers of the New Testament wrote these things, it had to infuriate the hardline Jews that refused to accept Christ. Now, there were a whole lot of Jews that did, and I don't want to say anything any different. But those that were hardline, especially those that were going to lose control, the councils, the high priests, those kind of people, this kind of thing would have infuriated them for that reason. Again, because they knew what all of this meant. So that's my side path off of my side path. Okay, let's go back to Deuteronomy 3. And that's where we find this. I'm not going to read it, but for your reference, it's Deuteronomy 3, 10 through 14, where the land was given to Manasseh. And that's the context of that passage. Okay. So now on to intermarrying. The source of following the split of the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, the source of what came about to begin to, how Samaria came about. Go to Deuteronomy 7, all of this you may be thinking this makes sense and all of this, and we're going to get to the end. We're going to have a good twist. We're going to have a good conversation. So Deuteronomy 7, beginning in verse 2. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you to defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, because they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will swiftly destroy you. Okay. Did the patriarchs in the time of Joshua do what they were supposed to do? No. Understand that this is like one generation between the time this is written and the time that Joshua went into the promised land and the patriarchs were given this land and told to wipe everything out that was in their land. So they heard about it from Moses. Their fathers heard about it from Moses. They went in and didn't do it. Fast forward to Isaiah, roughly 700 years, and now what's happening? God is destroying them. God is fulfilling his promise that he made here because they turned away. They intermarried. They followed down these paths of idolatry and the false worships. So,
how many years was that?
Roughly 700 between Joshua and Isaiah, roughly.
I misheard. I thought you said 7,500.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, 700 between Joshua and Isaiah. Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go to Exodus 10. What do we know about Jewish teachings in the family, in the households? Yep. They continued to repeat these things daily, didn't they? Now, I'm sure in every household it was told just a little bit different, but it was the same message throughout all of them. So when we go back and we look at these things are being taught supposedly being taught in the households by the fathers and by the grandfathers to the young children. Okay? All right, Exodus 34. Beginning in verse 10. Then God said, "Behold, I'm going to make a covenant. Before all your people I will perform miracles which have not been produced in all the earth, nor among any of the nations, and all the people among whom you live will see the working of the Lord, for it is a fearful thing that I'm going to perform with you. Be sure to observe what I am commanding you this day. Behold, I'm going to drive out the Amorite before you, and the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, lest it become a snare in your midst. But rather, you are to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and cut down their Asherim. For you shall not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and sacrifice to their gods, and someone invites you to eat of his sacrifice, and you take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods." I had to stop and look, see how far I was supposed to read. "You shall make for yourself no molten gods, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days, for you are to eat unleavened bread as I commanded you at the month of Ahab. You came out of Egypt." Okay. Pretty clear, isn't it? I came across an interesting article, and I bring it up just because I thought it was an interesting argument that we may run into. The content of this, the context, obviously, is in the purity of faith and obedience to God. I don't think there's any question that that's the context of this passage. Briefly scanned an article that cited this as evidence that God is against interracial marriage. Now, I will give the author credit that he did debunk that in his article. But it is being used by people. And if you want to step back and pull this out of context Yeah, you can use it to justify whatever you want to justify. People do all the time. But what is the real warning here? Why was it important for the Jews not to intermarry?
Well, I mean, it basically says it because if they would have intermarried with the people, you know, they would have been led astray by their gods.
It's like the loss of faith for a Christian marrying a non-Christian.
Yeah. You get pulled away from the faith because, you know, when you're with a partner, you want to please your partner, so you know you have a happy marriage, and so they could be led astray into their beliefs and religion.
Yes, I think there's another reason why the Jews were not to intermarry. Was that a hand or? Thank you. To me, that's exactly right, is that if the Jews had not remained true to their heritage, to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or as descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then there would have been argument against Christ for his perfection of sacrifice. Okay. I guess that's probably the best way I can say it. So yeah, I thought, yes, it directly comes into why Samaria ended up forming. But I think that the lineage that produces Christ is probably the more important reason that they were not to intermarry. They fell away enough as it was without the intermarriage, didn't they? They didn't need help.
They didn't really even last one generation.
They did not, no. I'm sorry, Terry? That's always the flip argument to that, is that the faithful could be the stronger one and bring the non-faithful, yes. That's part of the reason why I think the real purpose was to maintain the purity of the lineage for the birth of Christ. Again, they did not need to intermarry to fall into idol worship. Look what Aaron did. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
And that's another reason why you should never be unequally yoked with an unbeliever, is because think about your children. Even if you maintain your Christianity through the relationship, what if your children looks at their spouse that isn't saved and say, I want to follow that. I don't want to follow Christianity. Children, another reason we shouldn't be married to non-Christians, because, you know, that always causes conflict.
Good point. Yep. 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 Which, to your point, is why he specifically says, take no daughters for your sons and do not give your sons to their daughters, because you do have the influence from both sides. So, yeah. About 20 years ago, I taught high schoolers, and we got into Acts, and when we got to the 6th or 7th chapter of Acts, I'd always do a side lesson on elders and deacons. Just because an elder is qualified doesn't mean he's perfect. Okay? My analogy for those kids was always that the qualifications for an elder is not a checklist. It's a description. And so if you look at the Mona Lisa as one of the premier works of art in the world, there are misstrokes on that painting. But you don't look for the misstrokes. You stand back and you see the painting. To me, that's what an elder is. So to your point, we really don't know what that man did in his household as far as how he interacted with his son. But anyway, that's a really side step off of where we are. Go ahead, Ed.
I think looking at what they is different than looking at what God did.
Yep,
And we're still suffering for their disobedience.
we are.
We have war in the Middle East right now.
Yeah. War in the Middle East goes all the way back to Abraham. Yeah. Goes all the way back to Abraham with the birth of Ishmael. Yep.
Oh, yeah, because apparently the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael and the Jews are descendants of Abraham. I mean, Isaac, right?
Correct. Correct. Which is why the Muslims claim
Yeah.
to be a descendant of Abraham. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
The Muslims are apparently descendants of Ishmael, while the Jews are descendants
Of
of
Isaac. Correct. No. No.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And it goes back to their culture with the firstborn being the heir. Yeah, a whole lot of more things to go down that road. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Who has Issachar in that reading from Exodus? If I remember my notes correctly. And I may have skipped and forgot to put a note in there about this, but I think. Yeah. You see Issachar on this map. He was one of the sons, and we're going to get more into that. A small section of land. He was actually, if I remember right, the fourth son to Jacob and Leah. And that also is part of where Samaria is. Not Issachar, Issachar. So in Genesis 49, where Jacob blesses his sons, 49:13, Zebulun shall dwell by the seashore and become a harbor for ships, and his border shall extend to Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey lying between the sheepfolds. He saw that his resting place was good and that his land was pleasant, so he bent his shoulder to the burden and submitted to labor as a servant between the Gadites and the Reubenites. So you see Zebulun, you see Issachar, you see the half-tribe of Manasseh. Okay. So that's where he sits between these what's the word they're used? Between two sheepfolds. Now, again, because I continue to run down rabbit holes in that, there are two different etymologies for the name of Issachar that have been proposed based on the text of the Torah, which some scholars attribute to different sources, one to the Yahwist and one to the Elohist, things that we've talked about offline, outside of class. The first derives it from Ish-Sakar, meaning man of hire, in reference to Leah's hire of Jacob's sexual favors for the price of some mandrakes. The second derives from Yesh-Sakar, meaning that there is a reward, in reference to Leah's opinion that the birth of Issachar was a divine reward for giving her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob as a concubine. Most scholars, though, go with the first one. Some scholars have proposed a third etymology that derives from Ish-Sakar, meaning man of Sukkar, in reference to the tribes perhaps originally worshiping Sokar, an Egyptian deity. I thought that was kind of interesting. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But I thought it was interesting that there's even an inference all the way back to the sons of Jacob that there was idolatry worship. So, but if you go to Genesis 30:18, this is where the idea comes that it derives from Leah's hire of Jacob's sexual favors for the price of some mandrakes. Genesis 30:18, and Leah said, God hath given me my hire because I have given my maiden to my husband, and she called his name Issachar. I want to make a note here, just kind of an asterisk. You see all of this tumult around Issachar. Issachar, like Ishmael, came from a concubine, not from a wife. So just a side note. Now, it didn't matter. All of Jacob's 12 sons were given a section of land with the exception of one. Which one? Which tribe? One tribe did not get land. The Levites. Yeah. The other 11 were given land. So, okay. All right. It's a whole lot of background here. So let's get to what we're really talking about here. The Assyrian role in the creation of Samaria between 745 and 681 began about 911 BC. And as we've studied, ended by the Babylonians around 670 BC, roughly 20 years after the death of Isaiah. So chapter 28 of Isaiah was written about 725 BC. Captivity began about 732 BC. So this action of the Assyrians hauling Jews off to captivity and bringing in foreigners had been going on for somewhere between 7 and 10 years, somewhere in that time frame. Again, because we've talked about dates are kind of fluid. So Isaiah is looking at it from that perspective, already seeing this happen. And I think that may have been some of the reason for the language in chapter 28 where he talks about the drunkards of Ephraim and he talks about the idolatry. You're already starting to see this come on with them. In fact, the Assyrian Empire made use of a resettlement policy, wherein some portions of the populations from conquered lands were resettled in the Assyrian heartland and in underdeveloped provinces. The policy served to both disintegrate local identities. Look at that word there, to disintegrate local identities, and to introduce Assyrian-developed agricultural techniques to all parts of the empire. A consequence was the dilution of the cultural diversity of the Near East, forever changing the ethno-linguistic composition of the region and facilitating the rise of Aramaic as the regional language, a position the language retained until the 14th century. What is important about that? What language did Christ speak? It was the language of the common man in that time frame, wasn't it? Okay. So you see God setting all of these things up so that the word of God could be spread following the crucifixion of Christ in the new covenant. None of these things are by accident. They all have their roots coming along the way. Okay. Now let's take a look at a different side. Let's take a look at New Testament references to Samaria. And before we get there, what I want to mention, I know I took notes of this, is that the first time, and I didn't write it down, but in the first time that the term Samaritan is used, shows up in Nehemiah, I believe it is, or Ezra. So, down in this time frame, okay, far after Isaiah, which is why you don't see Samaria written in chapter 28, because Samaria didn't exist yet. Okay, the region had been infiltrated, but the nation of Samaria, this concept had not yet developed during Isaiah's time. It happens close to the time of the Maccabees, just kind of for a reference there. Okay. All right, let's go to John 4. As you're turning there, if you think about Samaritans in the New Testament, what's the first thing that comes to mind? The Good Samaritan. What's the second thing? The woman at the well. Mm-hmm. That's all right. There's a third one there too, but it's a little more obscure if you're not paying attention. I was thinking of the leper. But yeah. So let's go to John 4. And I want to start with this one because this, John's account, is the only gospel that this appears in. John 4. When therefore the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, though Jesus himself was not baptizing, his disciples were, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour, and there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman therefore said to him, "How is it you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water shall thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way to draw." Oh no, no. Bert, I blame you. And he said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have well said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one to whom you have now is not your husband, and you have said truly." Okay, so I was originally going to go all the way to 26. So we have an interaction with Christ with one of these Samaritans. Is there anything else in there? No. Okay. This was part of the interesting part of this passage in verse 27. At this point, his disciples came and they marveled that he had been speaking with a woman, yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why do you speak with her?" And I thought that was an interesting observation, that the apostles did not challenge Christ for talking to a Samaritan. So, okay. For your references, grab pens and write these down, and because we're not going to have time to go through these. You know what? We're about to get into what I was going to consider the most fun of this lesson. And and we just simply don't have time. So we're going to postpone this till next week. But for your references, I would like you to take a look at, in addition to rereading this passage 1 through 26, John 8:48, but beginning at verse 31, go from 31 to 49. Luke 10:25 to 37. Luke 17:11 to 19. And then I have Matthew 10:5 and Luke 9:52 written down as well. I'm sorry, write faster. We're about to get a second buzzer, and then I'm going to get fussed at for needing a third buzzer. Matthew 10:5. Luke 9:52. And then I'm going to ask you to look at Acts 1:8 and Acts 8:4 through 8. And we're going to go back and talk about that. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think we're going to get into all of that, which is what I really would have liked to have gotten to this week, but we're going to pick back up and get into it and finish it up next week before we go back into Isaiah straightforward. But I found what I consider to be an interesting observation that I don't think we think about a lot, that in these passages that I gave you to take a look at. So, any last comments? Edward, would you close? Amen. Thank you all very much.